me see if I can break that down for you. Think about it this way. At some point in time, late 20s Common Era in Syro-Palestine, we have the context. There we discover the context of the pre-Paschal Jesus himself. Folks, pre-Paschal means Jesus prior to the passion, death, and resurrection. Okay? He's alive. He's walking around, talking in villages of Galilee, and people are listening to him. They're being healed by him in a certain context around 2,000 years ago, in a very alien culture than ours. After Jesus' death and resurrection, there is another time, another period of time, where other people talk about Jesus, talking about stuff and doing stuff. Every one of these people in this other time is either recounting memories or hearsay. And they're doing it in a new and different context. Think about this. If I said things to you and did things to you, then I died and somehow was revealed to you as Cosmic Lord, and you remembered back what I said way back when, wouldn't you have to recontextualize and resituate and reevaluate everything I said and did that you remember? Because before you didn't know I was Lord. Now I'm the Cosmic Lord. That's going to change things, right? And when you retell them, that's going to affect that new understanding of me, right, is going to reshape what I said before. As this spreads, folks, throughout a region, it diversifies. Contexts multiply left and right. And the result of this is the meaning of the spoken parables of Jesus necessarily is changing. Again, according to the Second Vatican Council's Dogmatic Constitution on Divine Revelation, Dei Verbum, number 19, the Pontifical Biblical Commission's Instruction on the Historical Truth of the Gospels, sections 6 through 9, and the Universal Catechism, the Church teaches that our primary source for the history of Jesus, or a primary source for understanding Jesus, are the four written Gospels: Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. And our church teaches, the Catholic tradition, I know we have non-Catholics here, the Catholic Church officially teaches the only way we can understand this primary source for understanding Jesus, the four Gospels, is understanding the Gospels developmentally. That they developed, that they evolved. They weren't dictated by God. The Gospels themselves, Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John, emerged through a three-stage evolutionary process. Stage one, the original words and deeds of the pre-Paschal Jesus. Stage two, after the death and resurrection of Jesus in the light of Easter, the apostles saw Jesus now as Cosmic Lord and Messiah, and now they proclaimed him through catechesis, through narratives, through testimonia, through hymns, through doxologies, hymns of praise, and prayers as such. Stage three is the most neglected and yet most important stage. It's the stage of the communities of Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John, and which produced the documents we call by those names. This, according to our, at least Catholic tradition, respectful of everybody here, our Catholic tradition, that's what we teach. So let's see if I can show you that graphically. If we were to date the Gospels, and this information comes from the theology department of Boston College, we can see or imagine the first century of the Common Era from the year 30 Common Era, or AD, if we go by Denny the Dwarf, Dionysius Exiguus, Denny the Dwarf, 30 Common Era to 100 Common Era. 30 Common Era is the death of Jesus. So Jesus' ministry would be in the late 20s, maybe even late 29. Jesus is proclaimed risen almost immediately after he dies by his followers. The earliest literature we have as church comes from Paul, 1 Thessalonians, and his 7 authentic letters, which were written no earlier than 48 Common Era, no later than 58 Common Era. The earliest literature we have as church, 1 Thessalonians. Notice the difference in time. Whenever you move the language, temporally or spatially, you necessarily change the meaning. And the Holy Spirit works in this mess. In the 60s, as in the 1960s, you had a lot of assassinations, right, of great people. JFK, RFK, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King Jr., right? So we also lost some people in the church in the first century, or gained some people, depending on perspective. Peter, Paul, and James were all martyred in the 60s of the first century. Jerusalem is destroyed in AD 70. Almost around the same time, probably the community in Syria or Rome, the Jesus group there, the Jesus groups there, one of those Jesus groups, produced the first narrative gospel we have. We have later called it Mark. It had no autograph. Two other communities living in other places in the Mediterranean world, two other Jesus groups, got a hold of Mark. They had a copy of Mark sitting next to them and said, aha, I could do better than that. They followed his story pretty close to the vest. But they improved Mark as they saw it. One of these texts is what we call Matthew. The other text is what we call Luke. You notice the arrows going from Mark to Matthew and Mark to Luke? You notice you don't see any arrows going from Matthew to Luke and Luke to Matthew. That's because we know that Matthew never read Luke and Luke never read Matthew. But if you look at Mark, Matthew, and Luke with the same eye, synopsis, you get the same basic story. That's why they're called synoptic gospels. But you know what's funny? There's a whole bunch of sayings of Jesus, that are found in both Matthew and Luke. They're common to Matthew and Luke, but they're not found in Mark. We know that Matthew never read Luke. And we know that Luke never copied from Matthew. He never read Matthew. So how is it that Matthew and Luke have common sayings of Jesus that are not found in Mark? Where did they get these common sayings from? That's how scholars have been able to postulate the existence at one point of a document, a collection of sayings of Jesus, a sayings gospel, which scholars have called Q from the German word Quelle, which means source. So how do you reproduce that document? Very simple. You take the sayings of Jesus that are not found in Mark, but are found common to both Matthew and Luke, and voila, you got Q, more or less. But then we have the gospel from outer space. John is unlike Matthew, Mark, Luke, or Q, and it's very alien. It has a literary and theological evolution all its own. So to break down the 3 stages of gospel evolution, stage 1, stage 2, and stage 3. The official church teaching in the Catholic tradition among Christians is you will never understand these gospels unless you understand them developmentally. Moving right along. Here's another way of looking at it. So if I take all the literature of the New Testament, almost all, yeah, I could say all, I could see that there are 4 waves of Jesus groups which produce different materials with different focuses. The first wave would be the Jesus movement prior to his death and resurrection. The second wave would be groups like Paul forming second wave, sometimes called second generation. That would be when he's writing. The third wave would be the earliest narrative gospels, Mark, Matthew, John in an early form, 2 Thessalonians, Revelation. Fourth wave would be like Luke and Acts, Timothy, Colossians, the pastoral epistles. You notice how on the bottom tier, as you go from left to right, you're moving forward in time, from 30 Common Era to 100 Common Era and beyond. You notice how the theological focus shifts. That necessarily changes the meaning. Don't you think that's important that we get that when we're reading that material? What do you think? Consider, not a single one of the gospel writers themselves was an eyewitness of Jesus, the pre-Paschal Jesus. Oh, no, that's not true, Bill. Matthew was. John what? No. Those are the names we've given to the documents. But those documents were not written by members of the 12. John, son of Zebedee, and Matthew, Levi, the tax collector. So you have an attributed author, and then you have the real author. The real author, nameless. History has not remembered his name. None of the gospel writers of Mark, Matthew, Luke, or John ever met the pre-Paschal Jesus or heard from him his parables. Mark and Matthew stand third wave, third generation down the line after the pre-Paschal Jesus. Luke is the fourth wave, fourth generation. Mark is writing in either Syria, maybe Rome, definitely not the Galilee, where Jesus preached and healed, and he's writing 40 years after the lifetime of the pre-Paschal Jesus. Matthew is probably writing from Antioch in Asia Minor 50 plus years after the lifetime of Jesus, present-day Turkey. Luke is a fourth wave, fourth generation document after the pre-Paschal Jesus. Luke is writing from some large Greco-Roman city, possibly Athens, maybe Corinth, somewhere in what we now call Europe, some 50 to 60 years after the lifetime of Jesus. Understand what has happened, folks. Stories of Jesus, whatever they might have actually meant in their original context in which they were originally told, are now vibrating all over the Mediterranean world in new and different contexts. The result of this is the meaning of the stories were inevitably changed. Finally, we get to our culture. These stories arrive into our time and situation, that of 21st century American readers. These stories were not told for, by, or about Americans. Can we make use of them? What do you say, class? You guys are so optimistic. I like that. You know what I say? Maybe. Maybe. And if so, only with Herculean effort. Because our context by which we would use these stories is so radically different and alien than the original context in which these were told, causes for us innumerable and serious problems. We have to be very careful in attempting to understand these stories in their literal sense. What they meant originally to their authors and to their audiences.